Good morning. This is the Dr. Oba Tashaka show. And today we're going to have a very interesting discussion with the foremost scholar on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And the topic is the real Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King. And so this is going to be an interesting show for many of you. First, before I get into this, I want to note that our viewership has increased on the show that we did on the car. Last week it was 25,000. It's gone to 44,549 with a subscribers list of 943. And we're just 60 away from 1,000. And once that happens, I can put stuff up on the screen. We have faster algorithms. There's all kinds of stuff that happens. And a few of these advertisers have poached on my site and I'm kicking them off. This is not a hustling show for corporations. But for us to keep a show that's free, you're going to have to give it some real support. And I want to really say, for all of you that are new, hit the subscriber button. I also want to say to Contra Costa College, Black students and other students who are in Carolyn Hodges' class, right on to the right on. And to Carolyn Hodge, right on to you. She's a former student of mine. She's professor and chair of Black Studies at Contra Costa, and Professor Menu Ampin and her are cut buddies. They kick butt at Contra Costa. You know what I mean? They're a team. And by the way, I want to say to all you students that are watching, Carolyn's going to know whether you watch the whole show or not. She's got a system for that. So hit the subscriber button, everybody, and let's take off. This topic today is a topic that's very important. April the 4th was the anniversary of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. And so, we wanted to set this time aside to honor him. Professor Menu Ampin is a special person to me. You're very honored to have him in your presence. He's one of our best scholars. And I'm real hard on everything, starting with myself. So I don't put too many people in the category of best. You know what I mean? You gotta be the best. And what I like about Professor Menu Ampin is he's a researcher, he's a writer. He also teaches at Contra Costa College, but he's a community scholar so that he shares his information with the community, and he's a conscious scholar. I've known Menu for a long time. Before I knew him, I knew his father. And his father was active in a group that we had called Buffer, Black United Front for Educational Reform, organized by myself and brother Oscar Wright, who is now in his late 90s. He's a multimillionaire. He lives in the heart of the Black community, and he's Mr. Education. He is one tough, beautiful brother. And so it's there where I met Menu's father, and then got to meet Menu. And I remember when we first met, one of my conversations with Menu was, man, you need to get a gig because all this work you're doing here, you can't be broke. Broke's no joke. And he went ahead and got him a gig, an appropriate gig, a hard working gig, because Contra Costa, you got to teach 5 classes. I don't think you know what that means. That is rough, rough, rough. I had to teach 4 at San Francisco State. Then they reduced it to 3. UC Berkeley, only 2. Some universities, only 1, because you got to do preparation. So it's rough work teaching, that many classes. But then he's also doing other work. So what distinguishes his work from a lot of other work is he goes to primary sources. And this is also what's going to distinguish what he has to say about the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, that he's done his homework. Manu, could you give the viewers a little background on yourself? Um, who were the major influences, or who was the major influence on you becoming a conscious African? Tell us about your educational background and your scholarly interest, because I know it's not just on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King.
Dr. Tashaka, I appreciate the intro and glad to be with you on your program. Congratulations. I know that when you were working hard to launch your program and even in retirement, that just means retirement from the establishment. It doesn't mean retirement from the ongoing work. And I'm glad to be with you today. Well, my background, I've been trained in Africana studies to really do original or primary research. I did my work actually at Morgan State University. And for my master's thesis, I actually chose the topic of the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King, where I took it seriously, whereas many students, they just kind of just go through the motions so they can get their degree. But for me, I wanted to make a contribution for the ages. And when I was working on the project in 87 and 88 and 1989, I don't think you remember this, Doctor, that when I was developing my work on the revolutionary Dr. King, I had a stack of firsthand sources and and I had original material, speeches, and I actually called you from Morgan just to check in, make sure that I was on the right track as a young scholar. And I asked you about Malcolm and Dr. King and the similarities, and you were gracious. We spent maybe a little bit of time on the phone. And so you really confirmed what I was learning in my work, because I was not only concerned about making a contribution regarding my work on Dr. King, who's the most misrepresented and misunderstood figure in U.S. history, but I also wanted to embrace African civilization. So I'd done quite a bit of work around the world in a couple dozen countries to do original research by going to museums, institutes, libraries, and then in the field, going to pyramid sites, temple sites, tomb sites, and ancient residential sites. And the biggest influence on my work as a professional historian and an activist has been none other than Dr. Chancellor Williams, the researcher who wrote The Destruction of Black Civilization. And what inspired me about Chancellor Williams's work in the 1950s is that he went to 26 African countries and did research in 105 different language groups. So I was inspired by that. And then in terms of just the sheer manliness, I was inspired as I began to look more and more at the revolutionary Dr. King. And so my work expands now more than 3 decades.
I understand your father was also an influence on your consciousness.
Absolutely. My father was absolutely crucial and critical. The early upbringing of my mother and father, I remember back in 1984, I remember he had introduced me to life-saving books. And I didn't know this kind of knowledge about African civilizations existed at the time. And I remember I went over his place on a Saturday and he opened up his closet. It was life-saving, self-explanatory books that he exposed me to. Books like, as the one I mentioned, The Destruction of Black Civilization, books like Ethiopia and the Origin of Civilization, books like The Origin of African Civilization, Myth or Reality, books like The Story of Marcus Garvey, Black Moses. I was stunned by this. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. I never conceived of any of this. And I remember leaving my father's apartment that day with an armful of books. And I've never been the same since. But that was the life-saving materials that he gave to me. And I recognized it. Why was I so receptive? I recognized that really it was the framework and the foundation that I received at home, because I never thought once negatively about Black people or about Africa. So I didn't have to unlearn that. I was already just, I didn't think much about it, but I certainly wasn't negative. So I definitely credit both my mother and father. But my father, that one day has been transformative in my life. And I use his personal library as my library. I was 21. Some books I can understand, others were a little bit over my head, but yet I would check out books and return others until I can build my own library. So those have been some of the more immediate influences in my life and my work.
Yeah, I hope that viewers observe something here, because you hear me constantly talking about the strength of African American, or what I call new African culture. And we're going to be examining one of the examples of that strength. the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the movement that he was a part of and a leader of. And we often underestimate the strength of our culture. And in this particular case, Next to God, for the last 4 sessions, most of them at least, we've been discussing God within and the spirit. And we're going to see how that plays out with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. But next to that, in African culture and African American culture, is family. Family is a fundamental foundation. We've been talking about the Ka and how you pick your destiny in heaven. I think it's not a coincidence that Menu had the parents he had, and particularly the father that he had. And so don't discount the strength of your culture. And we're going to be examining it in great detail. Now, Menu, in the context of the Black freedom movement of the 50s and the 60s, how do you view the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King's historical significance to the Black freedom movement? How would you define his role in the Black freedom movement and also some of his personal qualities?
Well, I appreciate that question because we really have to re-examine that. And something you just said a second ago, Brother Oba, is that, you know, in terms of destiny and all of that, one thing that's important about Dr. King is that he understood that he was a world historical figure. And he began to understand that he had a particular role that only he could fulfill. So he would always talk about, and he would use a German term called the Zeitgeist, which means spirit of the times. And King translated as a revolutionary spirit. And as a young man who just out of seminary with a young family in Alabama, he had the goal of just becoming a regular everyday preacher. But he understood that he had to move into and embrace his calling. And so his calling was for him one in which he had to embrace. It's not something that he went out to do to be a leader, but he became a leader. And one of the things that drove Dr. King was his absolute strength and unable to be co-opted or misdirected. This was a man of tremendous principle and character. And folks don't recognize that he started his work in his mid-20s. So he had a lot to learn. And who in their mid-20s embraces their life mission? And very few. But for him, it was a bigger calling and a bigger mission. And I think the role of Dr. King was one of a transcendent leader, somebody who had the ability to communicate with even the people in the community without degrees, without formal college or academic training, because him as a PhD and as a minister, he's used to presenting. He had the incredible ability to articulate and understand things, but to the average everyday person. That's why when local organizers were working, Dr. King was always central to that. He was an organizer too, but his bigger role was as a spokesperson and a visionary to move people towards action. And one of the things that has to be known about Dr. King, he wasn't just a minister with a gospel on Sunday. He had a political gospel, he had a economic gospel, and a social gospel. So when he talked about the beloved community, for King, it was about taking the principles that people often talk about in religion or spiritual systems and making it a reality in the community. So he had a practical gospel that he lived by on a regular and consistent basis. And this is what made him such a strong leader, because he was someone who embraced his wasn't an occupation, it was his vocation in life. And this is what helped me to understand that even in the most difficult times, you cannot doubt. You can't doubt the outcome. You have to move forward because that's your role, that's your goal, and be able to be that unique person, whether people understand it or like it or agree with it. Doesn't matter. There's a fundamental difference between an occupation and a vocation. That's one of the things that I fundamentally learned from Dr. King. And that's why so many people were drawn to him, because of the strength of his manhood and his unswerving commitment.
Very well put. I would like to add a few things, and partially to piggyback off of what you said. More than anything, he was the maximum spokesperson for the Black freedom movement, because there were really 2 wings of the movement. One that really developed out of the movement, which was the Black Power, Black nationalist wing, but there was also the Malcolm wing, the movement, but he was the maximum spokesperson for the Black Freedom Movement, which was the most important movement of its time. And this is what a lot of the radicals in the North missed. They be running around talking about, oh, I couldn't take that head whip and all the rest of that stuff. But they were missing the fact that, first of all, the masses had rose up in the South. That was the Montgomery bus boycott. And then it threw forward leadership. And so the masses made a decision, and under most difficult circumstances, where to be Black, you could be lynched for just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. It took a whole lot more courage than for us to stand up on a soapbox in New York or somewhere else and proclaim our revolutionary beliefs. So he was an expression of that. And without that movement, no Northern movement. Without that movement, no King nor Malcolm, by the way. You know what I mean? So don't underestimate. So your point about him being a spokesperson, I think that hits the nail on the head.
Yes, sir.
He really wasn't a great organizer. He definitely was not an administrator. He had other people who did the organizing, but he was the spokesperson for the movement, and magnificent spokesperson, poetic spokesperson. And in the movement, he was called the Lord.
The Lord, yeah.
Because he had that royal dignity. It wasn't just his name. That's everyday Black people. Everyday Black people have this royal quality about him, and he had that in spades. So the other point, you made about spokesperson is King was an expression of the best features of our culture, but he only understood that to a point, because we haven't really analyzed our culture. And we'll go through this as we go through the show. But he made a comment in the Montgomery bus boycott. I didn't start this boycott, but when the people called on me, I stood up as a spokesperson for the people. And it's your point, he didn't come in to be a leader. He was pushed into that role. That was his destiny. But the other thing is, this conforms to African conceptions and African-American conceptions of leaders. Leaders are not the dictators. Leaders at their best speak for what the people want and dedicate their lives to it. And so that was the heart and soul of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. And your point about incorruptible, that cannot be emphasized enough, because it's a rare quality. How many people get in the midst of a struggle like this and the temptations take them down? And we're basically talking about the temptations of money and power.
And women.
Yeah, well, the women part, now he had a problem with that, but it didn't take him down. So he had shortcomings, you know what I mean? And he also had some picturesque ways of describing why he did that. I won't go into this show on that. It might not be appropriate, but the point is they were manly instincts, but he went to an excess on that. He wasn't perfect, far from it. So for you to see that's important, because a lot of our conscious people, they got problems with some of this, in terms of King, because it's always associating him with his tactics and not looking at what the overall thing about him was. Now, what is the primary research that you've done on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? And what I want to say is Manu is a researcher. He goes into primary material. He doesn't just go off of what someone else had to say that had already written it. He's going in and going into new stuff.
Yes, sir. Well, the firsthand and primary research that I've done on King, I've spent hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours at the FBI headquarters in DC. I've gone to the archives there. I've gone to the King Center in Atlanta, not just to go and see a couple things here and there, like his shoes and his Bible and his tote bag, things like that. No, but to go upstairs to the archive. I went to the Muger Archive in Boston, where there's a King collection there. I've looked at all of his press conferences, his speeches, his sermons, his interviews, all of these records. He wrote 5 books as well. So I combed through all of the King records, interviewed people who work with Dr. King who weren't in his organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, but who were in the Black Power movement, mainly Willie Ricks, Brother Mikasa, and Stokely Carmichael. I specifically talked to these great revolutionaries about Dr. King and my work. And so my primary research was really to look at all of these comprehensive sources. And one of the things about the so-called conscious community, or most people in general, they have not read a single word by Dr. King. They don't know what Dr. King was about. It's just the great level of misinformation. People hear a speech here or a speech there, but they haven't gone to the text. They haven't gone to the record. So we've been set up and duped by people who've misrepresented Dr. King. And when I did the primary research in the King archives, for example, I was really amazed. I'll give an example. If somebody reads materials on Dr. King, most of what they read about him has nothing to do with his real position. And when we go to the archives and read his books, he wrote 5 books, and very few people, Professor, can even name his books, let alone read them. But he outlines exactly what his work and his calling was over the 12.5-year period. So I spent about a year and a half, 2 years going to every single record that I can possibly get. And one of the things, for example, is what most influenced King and what he was most concerned about. If we go to the massive archive at the King Center in Atlanta, is the African liberation struggle, the African struggle for independence. That's the biggest and the most comprehensive file in the archive. Yet, who was written about this? Who even articulates the fact that he had relationships with revolutionaries on the African continent who were using arms to fight for independence? So what we have instead is authors like, I'll put it out there so people are very clear, David Garrow, who wrote Bearing the Cross. And it just so happened when I was working on my master's thesis on the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King and going through the archives beginning in 1987, David Garrow's book had just came out, and so did the book by Taylor Branch, Parting the Waters. These are 2 outsiders. These are 2 white scholars who are not a part of the Black freedom movement in any kind of way. Dr. King's organization was based in Atlanta, and Taylor Branch lived in Atlanta. And he said that he never met Dr. King because of quote unquote disinterest. What do you mean disinterest? Here you have human beings being brutalized and dehumanized by a vicious, as King was saying, handiwork of white society. And this man had no interest in assisting in any kind of way. And then after the fact, when all of the smoke is cleared and is safe, then he comes out and writes a book and gets a Pulitzer Prize. But when we look at David Garrow's book, he mentions that Dr. King was keenly interested in the African liberation movement, and that was the biggest file. He says that and never writes a single additional word about it. And yet it's a 800 page book. So I used that statement to go to the archive and look for that African file and saw that this was a distortion of King. And so doing the original research, everything we think we know about Dr. King has little to do with facts. People think, for example, that Dr. King was somebody who was simply committed to civil rights. He certainly was not. He stopped focusing on civil rights after 1965. People think that he was the apostle of nonviolence, and he was a pacifist who was unalterably committed to nonviolence. Not at all. Dr. King said that it's a false debate or whether or not a person should defend themselves or not. He said that has been embraced by all nations since the beginning of organized society, that you should always defend yourself when attacked and your family. He said the question was not whether or not you should defend yourself and your family. The question was simply whether or not it was tactically wise to carry a knife or gun during a demonstration. Because if you did do that, you were probably going to get into a skirmish with the police, and then the media and the propaganda machine would focus on the skirmish with the police and not the fact that Black people were lacking rights. And this is what is dominant in the archives. He consistently makes these points, but yet people believe, because they haven't read anything by King, most people, or they've read superficially, that he was simply committed to nonviolence. And for him, it was a strategy, because we see him consistently embracing armed liberation movements. He does not draw a lot of attention to it, in the early 60s, but he certainly comes out unequivocally in the mid and late 60s before he was assassinated to embrace publicly armed liberation struggles in Africa because he said those struggles were winnable. He said, but in America it's a different story. He said the right wing racists, he called them white supremacists on a regular basis, the government, the army, the National Guard, he said they wouldn't hesitate to exterminate, to use his term, every black man, woman, and child. So I was like amazed that he's saying this in his writings, his essays, his books, his speeches, his interviews, and yet when it comes to a popular award-winning biography, all of this is omitted. And then the public hears snippets of speeches rather than the entire speech. So for me, it's and Dr. Shaka, here's one of the things that will stun people. The most popular speech, and here's where the careful analysis comes in. The most I would say arguably the most popular speech in the history of America is the I Have a Dream speech. It's certainly one of the most well known. Yet that speech has not been listened to by most people. It's a 16-minute speech. What people get is the last 4 minutes, the I Have a Dream, but they don't listen to the first 12 minutes and they don't even drill down. So all those people who quote criticize King, they don't know anything about King. First of all, he wasn't in there to talk about a dream. He was there, to, as they said, to demonstrate for jobs and freedom and to dramatize a shameful condition. But not only that, he says twice in the I Have a Dream speech when he criticizes the horrors, quote unquote, the horrors of police brutality. He's specifically talking about this vicious system, and yet people don't even see it. They don't read about it. They don't know about it because it's popular to misrepresent King. Even with the most popular document, you have people that will use ellipsis marks when they publish it, so they don't have to publish the very part of the speech that they are uncomfortable with. Because he condemns police brutality twice, and he talks about the vicious racists in Alabama. And a lot of times, those very words are edited out of the most popular speech in the history of the country. So my work has taken me to all the archives on King and to read carefully all of his materials.
Very good. That's why we got you on the show. By the way, I want to point out to the viewers, we only bring in the best on this show. You hear me? And what you're hearing here, this is the best. Brother Zach Kondo, when he did his evisceration on the assassination, showing the multiple forces involved, he was the best on that. And so this analysis here, you should really soak this in. You made the point about Garrow and the other writers on King receiving Pulitzer prizes and whatnot. And they don't tell you anything that you didn't already know, but they also take him out of historical context. And so they give you the systems view of King. There's an African proverb that said, the animals in the jungle would never say of the live lion what they say when he's dead. You know what I mean? And so, yeah, Malcolm was the same thing. So you can go into all this mystification and basically regurgitation of facts, but not really looking at his growth, his development, what he was and what he became. Now you make the point about his position on Africa. Give a few examples of some of the relationships that he had with African leaders and some of the impact that the African liberation movement, the movement for independence, had on his own thinking.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. One thing that should be known is that Dr. King was very close to the African liberation movement throughout the continent in the 50s and 1960s, long before Malcolm and other Black nationalists. King, for example, went to the inauguration of Sadioufo Kwame Nkrumah in March of 1957. So Ghana was the first independent African country in West Africa. Most people say all of Africa is not true. Sudan was independent in 1956. So Ghana is the first in West Africa. King was there. And not only that, but King wrote an article about the birth of a new age. What he was talking about is a revolutionary age where people, not only in the US, but in Africa, were fighting for independence. He said that we have to keep our struggle in the US close to our our brothers struggle in Africa, quote unquote. And he said that these are the same struggle at root, quote unquote, is white supremacy and the contempt for life. That's what he said. So for King, he had direct relations, a lot of correspondence with Tom Mboya and people in the Mau Mau Revolution in Kenya, correspondence back and forth with them, correspondence with revolutionaries in Zimbabwe and South Africa. That's why that file was so big. There's correspondence, letters back and forth. There's other documents. There's articles. And King not only followed it as a passive person, but he also helped form and organize the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. And the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa in 1962, they formed an effort to do what they could to embrace those African revolutionary movements in a practical way by changing public policy to support them, helping to raise money. And so like, for example, and Dr. King and this group, they publicly, without hesitation or reservation, called for the support of revolutionary movements. Like, for example, and this is only, Dr. Shaka, this is only known in the archives. This is why it is propaganda for people to listen at these Pulitzer Prize winning authors and other phony biographers who carefully either write a superficial book, or if they do go to the archives, I got a stack of original documents. So they can't say it ain't so. So the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa, for example, in November of 1962, because of the revolutionary movement in North Africa, it was taking place in Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco. We're talking about, as I said, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Angola, and they embraced those revolutionary movements. And so what the organization said is that they, quote unquote, rejoiced with those nations of Africa who have taken their place in the community of free nations. So what were they talking about? They were talking about Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, and they all achieved their independence from France through armed struggle. They didn't say, hey, we support them, but we really wish that they would really, do it peacefully. No such thing. Also, 1964, the same organization, they made it very clear. They said, we support the nationals of Angola and Mozambique in their struggle for freedom and independence. And so that was actually in 61. And they continued in 64 to call for the support. And they said every support should be given to these revolutionary movements. King was a member of the American Negro Leadership Conference on Africa. He also was a board member and one who helped shape the policy of the American Committee on Africa. And George Hauser was the head of that group. George Hauser took a visit to Africa to firsthand be able to report on those revolutionary movements. And they publicly, without hesitation or reservation, also called for the support of armed revolutionary movements. And so Dr. King, what most people don't understand, when he started to criticize the US government against its involvement in the Vietnam War, and he said that America is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world and that we need to support the Vietnamese and pay them reparations, King had already taken that position, not only through those organizations, the American Committee on Africa and the American Negro Leadership on Africa, but he also, in his major speeches, he also took the position of embracing the revolutionary movements, regardless of whatever tactics or strategies that they were using. And so what happened was King backed away from that public support because the real Afro-Saxons, the real Negroes, they criticized King and said, they said he was taking away focus from the civil rights movement in the US and he should, quote unquote, stay in his place and not try to deal with international issues. But King was internationalizing the struggle in the early 60s until he received unbelievable criticism from conservative Black leaders and from the mainstream press. But the fact is that nobody will ever find any evidence at all that King ever, at any occasion, a sermon, a press conference, a speech, a statement to his board members in the SCLC, that he had issues with the method that African revolutionaries were using to win their independence. He said those are winnable struggles to kick out the oppressor. He said it's a different situation here at home, and that's why he takes a different position regarding self-defense or armed struggle in the US. He didn't think it was winnable. And, he was older and more mature. The young folks said, we need to go defend ourselves. Yeah, you know what? You need to also be prepared to count the dead bodies of Black folks going up against this vicious American machinery. So as you were saying, Doctor, it's not just somebody shooting off rhetoric from a soapbox in the street. Dr. King was an activist who experienced the deadly force that these white folks can use. So we said, we need to be practical. And he was practical. Yeah, sure. He wanted to use nonviolence. He hoped that it would work, but he was not sure that that was actually going to solve the problem in the U.S. And this is why he continues to radicalize his position over time as the struggle dictated. But that's the most important thing about Dr. King that gets missed among many other distortions, and that's his embracement of the movement and his correspondence with those revolutionaries to see what he could do on a practical level to support them.
Yeah, I think one of the very good, and you brought out some stuff that nobody knows. You're talking about King being practical. That's very important because if you're in a battle, your objective is to win. And so you've got to take positions that are winnable. And in the case of King's position on Africa, again, I really want to stress this because a lot of the people who listen to this show, a lot of Black folks, period, do not know our own culture and don't respect it that much, even though they live it. And the very things they love are most African, and they don't even know it's African. And King was a manifestation of some of the best features of African-American culture, just as Ella Baker was, just as a whole lot of Fannie Lou Hamer was. And she came out of some rough circumstances, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And so one of those features of the culture that we should note, Africa didn't come up with the idea of African unity. That didn't come from Africa. That came from enslaved Africans, and it came from Africans in the Caribbean, particularly Trinidad. Trinidad produced the largest number of Pan-Africanist intellectuals, but the grassroots throughout the Caribbean. And that came from the recognition that we didn't no longer remember what part of Africa we came from, but we embraced all of it. And it came from the wisdom of the masses who realized Africa, not one part of it would be free unless all of it was free. So in 1900, when Du Bois attends the first Pan-African Congress called by Sylvester Williams, who was from Trinidad, and his Congress is not counted, the first Pan-African Congress held in London. And Du Bois issues this statement of the problem of the 20th century, the problem of the color line. And then Du Bois takes up those Pan-African Congresses until the fifth Pan-African Congress, where he is the honorary chair. And by then Garvey's dead, but Garvey's ghost is hanging over that Congress, and one of his wives is attending. And so it's this idea of African unity, and then the unity of Africans worldwide. This comes from our culture. King was expressing that, but because in his pinnacle position as a maximum spokesman for the movement, he was viewing it at even from the mountaintop, looking down, seeing that what's going on and how does it globally connect. And I would say the most important thing about King is that he entered the movement one way, he changed. And he was open to learn. He was a good learner. And this is a real key point. Absolutely. So those points are very important. What you just heard Manu talk about ain't in no books, people. Some of you need to go back and listen to this show more than once. And some of you only listen for a half hour. You need to watch the whole thing because I'm presenting books, chapters and books. This is a chapter on the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, the revolutionary. And Manu, sooner or later, is going to put his master's thesis into book form. Needs to come out because his analysis on King is the best. And you're just getting a slight indication of it. Now, you stressed the importance of knowing the two periods of Martin Luther King when it comes to his political life and activism. What I want you to do on this part is just describe King's first period of activism and specify some of the specific achievements made during this period, some of the specific methodology he used that led to that, some of the setbacks and what he learned from it, just in the first period.
Okay. And then if you don't mind, Brother Over, I want to show just a slide to give people a visual of it and also challenge the audience as we are talking in the program now is to, from your own resources or you, whatever you need to do, make a list to see what, make a list of the 5 books that Dr. King wrote. And I guarantee hardly anybody, well, you know what? I think as of a few months ago, somebody online put books on our website, but generally most people can't get it because there's books written that are not what he wrote and people put King's name on it. So there's 2 periods in the political career of Dr. King in his 12 and a half years from 1955, late 55 with the Montgomery bus boycott to April 4th, 1968 when he was assassinated. So 12 and a half years. But that political career is divided into 2 periods. He divided his work and the Black freedom struggle into 2 periods, the civil rights period and then the human rights period.
And right now, I want you to focus on the civil rights period because
Okay.
we're going to come back to the human rights period. The reason why I want to separate.
Okay. All right. So the civil rights period is a period that Dr. King called the reform period. So this was from 1954 to 1965. And the reason why he started that civil rights period, he called it that, by the way, civil rights period 54, because that was the Brown versus Board of Education decision where the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal to segregate children on the basis of race in the public school system. So he said that was the legal turning point. And then he says sometimes, it depends on what speech he's given or what sermon he's given, sometimes he says that this civil rights period began in 1955 when the Montgomery bus boycott started in December of that year. So King would talk about the legal turning point with the Brown decision in 54. And sometimes he would talk about the psychological point where the Montgomery bus boycott starts. So that first period, Dr. King says is the legal turning point to challenge the Jim Crow system, but the psychological turning point was important because he said laws declare rights, but they don't deliver the rights. The people themselves have to go out and act. And he said that this first period was an important period. It was a psychological turning point because nobody can ride your back unless it's bent. So during this period in the Montgomery bus boycott, they just wanted, because under the Jim Crow segregation laws, Black folks had to go on the bus, pay their dime and physically get off the bus and then enter through the back. And if there were open seats in the front of the bus, didn't make any difference. You stand in the back as a humiliated person who's not a citizen. So Black folks had no rights to go in the white hotels, motels, restaurants, any kind of public facilities. It was Black folks and it was white folks. And so Dr. King believed early on that these were moral issues. Now he was a minister. So he thought that if the vast majority of white people supported this vicious segregation system, which is backed up by violence, that if they were told their moral errors, that they would change. So and during the first period, he was focused on moral issues. But King recognized that even after being explained, white folks did not seem to change. He also, during this first period, not just him, he's a part of a movement, and King did not produce the movement produced King. So many of them were focused on integration. They thought that, then they used the term integrate to integrate with white society. That was a goal. They were focused in this first civil rights period on protest, local concerns in the South, because the Jim Crow system of white supremacy was more prominent in the South. He focused quite a lot on nonviolence. And then towards the end of this period, which ends in 1965, he's focused on a dream. But King recognized that something's afoot here. We've been demonstrating and protesting and challenging, as he said, on a regular basis, not just white racists, but white supremacists. It's his term. He's not talking about people in the KKK or the White Citizens Council. He's talking about, they use his phrase, the vast majority of white folks. And so he was a vast majority guy. He didn't never say it all, so you couldn't trap him. He said the vast majority. So they had different demonstrations, whether it was Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted for 381 days. It was successful. Montgomery lost tons of money and they had to back up and back down. And so the Montgomery Improvement Association, they made some progress that Black people would be treated respectfully. But so that was kind of the beginning there. But all over the South, he participated in the Albany movement in Georgia. He didn't fare so well there, but then there's a Birmingham movement in Alabama. They never called it Birmingham. It was always Birmingham because of the vicious white supremacists bombing churches, bombing houses, bombing any meeting places that they could. And so then there was Selma movement for voting. And so King recognized that they had to push towards the first phase, which was to get laws passed so that at least the law was on the side of Black people who had no civil rights, had no voting rights, had no rights of any citizen or any real human being. So the goal was to try to shame white people to change the laws. And King recognized that after the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64, and then the Voting Rights Bill was passed in 1965, for his organization, as they said, that in a sense, Congress signed the civil rights movement out of existence. So once those laws were on the books by 1965, Dr. King was explaining to his staff in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that the first phase of their work is accomplished. They have these laws on the books. He said now the second phase is not going to be bargain rates for white folks who didn't have to give up anything. They didn't have to give up any taxes or anything else. But because some of the laws were now on the books, Dr. King said that helped to assuage the guilt of white people who obviously were exposed as nothing but a group of folks presiding over a savage anti-Black system. He said, so they got off quite easy with this first period. And so King begins at the end of 1965 to explain in his writings, in the conferences with his staff, that what the first part of the civil rights movement accomplished and what it didn't accomplish. This is what he said, for example. He said, first, even though we gained legislative and judicial victories during this period, he's talking about 55 to 65, these legislative and judicial victories did very little to improve the lot of millions of Negroes in the teeming ghettos of the North. These victories did very little to penetrate the lower depths of Negro deprivation, particularly in the North. Secondly, he said, however difficult it is for us to admit this, the changes that came about were at best surface changes. They were not really substantive changes. And finally, he says, this is in Frogmore, South Carolina. He's talking to his staff why they needed to move to the next phase. He said, a third thing that is necessary to see here is that while the period, talking about the civil rights period, represented a frontal attack on the doctrine and practice of white supremacy, it did not defeat the monster of racism. And we must never forget that the roots of racism are very deep in America. So he is explaining why they have to nationalize their work and start to work in the northern urban ghettos and move beyond civil rights to a much more broader focus on what he began to start calling human rights and the acquisition of power. So King recognized that they had to make the shift. And so here's a man now, he's not in his mid-20s. He's got a decade of struggle under his belt, and now he's in his mid-30s. He's a seasoned veteran activists who understand that there's a next phase ahead of them. And so most people, I would say 99% of the people, this is all they know about Dr. King, and that is the first phase. He moves away from these first phase areas of focus, and he starts to focus now on the second phase, or he called it the second period, which was the human rights period. And this is the King that emerged when the hot coals hit his lips and the fire was coming out of his mouth, and he's now operating on a different level. And this is the King that upset the media, upset the government, upset all these folks. They gave him a Pulitzer Prize during the first period. That seemed to be a victory. But as soon as he got that Pulitzer Prize, Pulitzer Peace Prize in 64, he was condemned by the FBI. He was praised by some, and he was condemned by others. But the fact is, things begin to change. So he was okay as long as he's talking about peaceful demonstrations and all that. But when you start talking about power, then things drastically change for Dr. King. So 65 ends that first period. And this is not what I came up with, is what he consistently discusses himself.
Yeah, very good. And there's a reason why I want to do the separation in these two periods. First, that's a very good analysis. And again, as a good scholar and a good researcher, you're talking out of his mouth. In other words, you're giving stuff that he actually said, how he perceived it, And then, of course, there's the reality that that reflects what was really happening in the broader movement. I just want to go back and just make a few points on some of the points you made. The Montgomery bus boycott. He would correctly define that as a psychological turning point, because what he says about that is he saw the birth of what he called the new Negro, that Blacks had a certain amount of fear instilled in them by this violent system, but that fear was being thrown off. And there was a new self-confidence, a new pride in themselves, because Blacks took on the system. And for me, it's one of the reasons I joined the Black Freedom Movement. I wasn't that conscious, but I saw what it meant for 97% of a Black community to stand up. In the history of America, 97% of white people have never done the same thing on anything. In fact, it's rare for any people to. 97%. They stood strong against threats, terror, everything else. And they had victory. And that was the beginning of the end of what you call legal apartheid. So that was a very significant victory. It showed the power of the masses when they moved, but it was also the middle class. Every sector of the Black community was involved in that. And it was a movement that the Blacks didn't think, let alone the whites thought, would be successful. And in fact, Ella Baker, Rosa Parks, who was in a leadership training at Highlander 2 weeks before the Montgomery bus boycott, I pointed this out on another show. She said, the Negroes in Montgomery will never get together. We're too divided. Little did she expect that she would be the lightning rod, and that a guy named E.D. Nixon, who actually laid out the strategy, because every movement's got to have some strategists, and he had been planning this one for a long time. And as some people know now, Rosa Parks had been a secretary in the NAACP working with E.D. Nixon, who was a Pullman car porter, organizer, and member of A. Philip Randolph's union. And so he's grassroots. He's the one that makes the decision to push King into the leadership. That wasn't King's decision. Absolutely. And in fact, there's a story, and I know you know the story, where E.D. Nixon, after Rosa Parks arrested and everything, and he's going to make a move, he calls Reverend King and says, well, can we have a meeting in your church? And he said, I'll think about it. I'll call you back. And then E.D. Nixon called him back and said, and then King said, yeah, you can have the meeting. He said, well, I already organized it. It was going to happen anyway. So that was the grassroots. And also E.D. Nixon said, I made the decision to raise this man to the stars because the power structure had not put their hands on King, meaning he hadn't been broken in. He wasn't one of these Negroes, pork chop eating people who are running around here speaking one way to Blacks and another way to whites. He didn't know what he was going to be, but he saw that he had some potential. So that Montgomery bus boycott was a significant historical turning point. And it was an indication that things are changing. And so the psychological awakening, but the political empowerment. The other thing is they found a method that worked. In this case, it was a boycott, a method that worked. Then the student sit-ins that spread across the country. Again, we underestimate our culture because Ella Baker made this observation. 55,000 Black students sat in lunch counters and stuff. And when I joined CORE in 1960, that was the main motion we were responding to as we built the San Francisco Freedom Movement. Ella Baker said that the sit-in movement spread because of extended family networks. Again, another feature of our culture. Family is second. And so those networks, those word of mouth messages that went from one Black community to the other, built that movement. So that was, again, now you're seeing something happening Southern-wide. King didn't start that.
Absolutely not. He was pushed into that position.
Exactly. And then Ella Baker is now acting executive director of the student of Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And she is then encouraging the sit-inners to have a meeting at Shaw University, which was a campus she graduated from, Black College. She was valedictorian, straight A student, militant, one of the two best organizers in the 60s, Malcolm being the other one. And King and them are pushing, let's take these youth and put them under SCLC. I was in Corps. Some of them wanted them under Corps. And she said no, but the students were saying no. And so they end up with an independent movement, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with close contact with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. They loved him, you know. And then Albany, what you referred to, and Birmingham, and then Selma. As you point out, he lost in Albany. And you know this, you pointed out, Pritchard, who was chief of police, had read his book. He wasn't your normal bulldog racist. He knew coming down on the movement violently would give it life. So he let him go to jail and stuffed the jails, but he filled up the county jails. And then when King got out, what they had promised, they didn't follow through on. So King had his reputation lowered by this movement, but it wasn't his fault. It was the local leadership that thought that the demands were going to be met. They believed in these good white people. Yeah, good for what? Birmingham, I think, was real key because that was his best planned movement, Operation Confrontation. They had learned from their mistakes in Albany, and so they orchestrated a movement that depended, as you pointed out, on a bulldog, in this case, Bull Connor, public safety commissioner, to sick his dogs and do everything else violent. And that would build sympathy for the movement. That was his technique of the mass movement, of the marches. And it was a guy who was a major organizer, James Bevels, who made Birmingham happen. I was in contact with our field secretary, Ike Reynolds, and he was telling me, because we dispatched him to Birmingham as our representative. So he told me two things. I don't know if you know this one. Robert Kennedy came in to Birmingham and threatened King with an IRS suit if he didn't pull out. Did you know that?
I did. And King did not trust Robert or John Kennedy. These were politicians looking out only for themselves, you know. And that same year in '63, that was the March on Washington. So John F. Kennedy tried to stop the March on Washington because he was embarrassed. How in the world could this be some great civil rights president when one of the greatest demonstrations for civil rights was a stone's throw from the White House? King did not trust them, and he knew the Kennedys were without moral compass. And that's why you never see King embracing any of these politicians. Vote your own conscience privately. That was his position.
Yeah. So, yes. Bobby had his phone bugged. John was trying to separate him from his advisor, Stanley Levinson, who was a Marxist and Jewish and radical, and gave him good advice. But that was a part of a network. Ella Baker and a few others made up that network. They conceived of the name Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You know what I mean? So Birmingham was key for a couple of reasons. For the first time in the movement's history, you have this term, the power structure, gets introduced. Up to this time, you know, as you point out, it's a moral movement in the South and so forth. But in this one, King has what he calls Operation Confrontation. So he takes on the power structure. And that's important because at that time, the people that ruled the country claimed, well, we don't know what power structure. C. Wright Mills that wrote a book, The Power Elite. But they were acting like there's no such thing. It made people conscious of how the country was being run. And I'm sure it opened King's eyes. And so that Operation Confrontation was a confrontation with the power structure of Birmingham. King had learned from Albany he needed leverage. So there was economic part to his movement of boycott as a part of a mass movement against segregation. That movement produces civil rights legislation. That's the key point. King's movements got results. And then out of that, Bevel's wife comes up with the idea of Selma. And now
Diane Nash.
Diane Nash, who was a great organizer. She's still alive. And then they were poaching on SNCC territory. But the fact of the matter is, this was a necessary movement. I was there. I was a March Marshal, got arrested there. So the point is that march from Selma to Montgomery, spurred on by the Raymond Pettus Bridge incident, creates a national momentum, and it forces Johnson to enact a voting rights bill. So the point is, these are the high points of that movement. And out of that, King has learned certain lessons. And as you point out, he realizes this phase of the movement is over. And that's perceptive on his part, because a lot of people at this point, by 65, are simply confused in the movement. They got different ideas about where the movement should go. And some are moving in a socialist direction. Some are moving in a nationalist direction. Many were just going out to get the goodies that they could because they thought that was what the movement was about. So King was perceptive to see that this was a change. This was a different period. So let's go into the second period, which is the one I know you're anxious to get into, to sink your teeth into. Describe why 1965 is viewed as the turning point period in the Black freedom movement, and why do you describe the period after 1965 as King's second period? What crises and challenges did King have to respond to after 65? And how were they qualitatively different from the challenges that the Black freedom movement faced prior to 65?
Okay, yeah, appreciate it. I would say it's kind of simple, really, in the sense that King himself laid out the first and the second period. And this is why it was so interesting, is that a person doesn't even have to do what I did and go to the archives. These are like public documents. And his last book is Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He lays out a pretty good part of his work in that one book. He wrote 5, but that one, he lays it out. So in terms of the two periods, Dr. King said there was 2 phases, and sometimes he calls it the Black freedom struggle. Sometimes he calls it, the Black struggle for freedom or liberty, and so forth. And so he said that after as you were pointing out, the Civil Rights Bill was passed in 64, and then the Voting Rights Bill in 65. For King, the laws on the books were important because now the police couldn't beat Black folks up unless they were doing it illegally. He just felt that they had to get the courts on their side to give them more leverage, and there needed to be victories in order to keep the movement moving forward. But King said that the second phase, beginning in 1966, he said it was the realization of equality. That's how he phrased it, the realization of equality, and that white people would not, because they would not be able to get by with quote unquote bargain rates, where they can allow Black people to go into different facilities, lunch counters, parks, hotels, other facilities. And so he talks about that, but he then discusses on a regular basis the transition from the first to the second period. So for him, it wasn't just equality, but he recognized there had to be power. So Dr. King, as he's moving with the movement itself, he begins to talk about human rights in the second period and the acquisition of power. And his understanding, it evolves, it moves forward as he was an activist in the movement, obviously. And with the James Meredith March Against Fear in June of 1966, this is when, even before that, in January of 1966, there's a shift. King's not focused on the southern areas getting laws passed. He moves the operation to Chicago, and they join the Chicago Freedom Movement. So in January of 1966 is when Dr. King begins to discuss and say specifically that the basic issue confronting all nations is that of human rights. He said, we've come to Chicago to raise the issue of human rights. He's not talking about civil rights anymore, because he understood that in Chicago, Black people had laws on the books, but they still were dwelling in slum conditions and being exploited. So he recognized that it was a very different environment in the North. And so therefore for him, he's now beginning to talk about human rights in January of 66. He's not focused on civil rights anymore. And then later that same year, when James Meredith was walking in the highway, he's the one that integrated the University of Mississippi, the show No Fear. He was shot on the highway. And so all of the civil rights, the main groups like the one you're in, CORE and SNCC, NAACP, and SCLC, these main civil rights organizations, they came together to support James Meredith. And the young Black folks in SNCC and CORE said, you know what? This is different. This is our battle. This is our turf. This is our issue. They told all the white activists in SNCC and others, thanks for what you've done in the past, but this is our struggle. You got to go. So they abandoned the agreement. They weren't talking about integration anymore. Black folks said, you know what? We're going to carry our weapons and defend ourselves against these racists. So they weren't talking about nonviolence. They weren't talking about integration. They did not allow white activists to continue. So this James Meredith March turned into the Black Power March. And so the NAACP pulled out. They said, we ain't a part of this. The more conservative members of SNCC pulled out, like John Lewis. I'm not a part of this. The more conservative members of CORE pulled out, said, we're not a part of this. But SNCC moved forward as well as the new leaders in CORE, and all of SCLC stayed with the Black Power March. So King was being radicalized in the midst of the movement. And so when Stokely because, SNCC had already been saying Black Power for Black people. They were using that phrase already in the South, Black Power for Black people. So that was not unusual. But what happened on that march is that Brother Mukasa Willie Ricks, he was the one with, who was like, they call him the Reverend. He shortened it from Black Power to Black people, for Black people to just Black Power. And when they unleashed the Black Power slogan in Greenwood, Mississippi, that's when the movement really took on a whole nother level. And so this is when, the Black Power call. So what do you want? Black Power. What do you want? Black Power. The video footage is amazing, because you see walking down the highway there that the reporter is got Stokely Carmichael on one side and Dr. King on the other, going back and forth with his microphone. What do you think about what Stokely Carmichael said, Reverend King? Do you support this call? So they're actually checking and correcting each other on the highway. King had a issue with the term Black Power because he said it sounded too much like white power and would give the white radical activists an opportunity to attack Black people and try to put them in the same category as the white racists and bigots and white supremacists and murderers. And so he said, so he's challenging these young brothers, but Dr. King begins on that march to use the term Black Power. And eventually what he does, he articulates that Black Power, and here's what he said. He said, look, y'all just talking about Black Power as a slogan. It needs to be a program. And so he began to talk about Black Power as a program. And so King wrote extensively on Black Power. One of his greatest essays on Black Power is simply Black Power Defined, where he's explaining, how do we implement Black Power in the labor movement? How do you implement Black Power in economic area, in the political arena? And he goes through all these different areas of why Black Power was important. But, he has no issue with the program of implementing Black Power. He just challenged the brothers on the semantics of it, but he embraced the Black Power. So in 1966, it's a transformative year. King talks about the second phase, and he began talking about human rights. Then he ends up talking about not only human rights, but the acquisition of power to implement these rights. And he now begins to articulate Black Power without hesitation or reservation. Like, for example, I'll give a couple quick examples. He says in his book, Where Do We Go From Here? He said, power properly understood is the ability to achieve purpose. It is the strength required to bring about social, political, and economic changes. He said, in this sense, power is not only desirable, but necessary in order to implement the demands of love and justice. One of the greatest problems of history is that the concept of love and power are usually contrasted as polar opposites. What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. There is nothing essentially wrong with power. The problem is that in America, power is unequally distributed. He said, Black Power is the call for the pooling of Black financial resources to achieve economic security. He said that Black is beautiful, and as beautiful as any other color. And then he goes on. He also says this, and folks, they miss this. He says that power is the ability to achieve purpose, but he also says power is not the white man's birthright. It would not be legislated for us and delivered in neat government packages. It is a social force any group can utilize by accumulating its elements in a planned, deliberate campaign to organize it under its control. And he goes on and says quite a lot more, but it's not the white man's birthright. So those people who are quote unquote conscious, when they try to dismiss King because of things they haven't read or don't know much about, he embraced, not only did he embrace the Black Power movement, he did not allow the government and the media to use him to condemn these young brothers and sisters who are in the movement. And when people are rising up in rebellions, not riots, but rebellions, when after this voting rights bill was passed, and yet Black folks still don't have any rights, you passed the voting rights bill on August 11th, 1965. 5 days later in Watts, they rise up and say, we don't respect that. And they start tearing up the city, and they want to bring it. Then they want to bring in Dr. King. Dr. King said, I'm not a fireman to put out these fires. Yes, it's unfortunate that they're tearing up the city, but you know what? This is a real, this is from real issues that they didn't create. They're responding to real issues in their own community. And so the civil rights establishment, A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, NAACP leadership, and all of them, Dorothy Height, they took out an ad in the New York Times. It was covered by the New York Times on October 14th, 1966. They held a press conference. It was the so-called 7 Negro leaders, October 14th, 1966. And their statement was to condemn the Black Power movement and the activists and condemn all of it. And so when one of the reporters asked these leaders, well, what's Dr. King's position on this? They tried to say, well, King supports us. And so when King heard about this, he was upset, and the records in the FBI clearly says that King was upset. He's talking with his advisor, Stanley Livingston, you mentioned earlier, and others, to figure out how can he get out of this, because he doesn't agree with these. He called them, he said, how can I maintain credibility with the community if I'm working with quote unquote Mickey Mouse Negroes? That's exactly what Dr. King called them. And so then on October 17th, Martin Luther King took out an ad. So his advisor said, look, you need to come out with a public statement. October 17th, 3 days later, Dr. King took out an ad in the New York Times. Anybody can look it up. And it says, Dr. King clarifies his stand. In other words, Dr. King clarified his stand because he did not agree with their statement. He did not condemn those brothers and sisters in the Black Power movement. He simply said he was committed to his goals to bring about equality for Black people. And so he was upset that they tried to pull him into this negative position against the young brothers and sisters. But it's very clear that King is entrenched in this second period now. Now he understands that there's a whole nother level of work that has to be done. And for King to remain relevant, he had to stay with the young activists who were becoming more and more radical. And that's when the movement, as you well know, Brother Jashaka, that the movement splits in June of 1966. Either you're a conservative civil rights person or you're more radical with the movement. And King stayed radical. No one would ever find any statement of him condemning the young brothers and sisters. He worked with them, stayed with them, organized with them, and all of his writings clearly indicate that, including all of his public books. You don't even have to go to the archive to see that he embraced the Black Power movement, not as a slogan. He's not promoting it on that level, but as a program that needs to be implemented. And so, and I just wanted to share this one thing here, Professor, just what I mentioned. I'm just showing this quick slide so people can see visually the two periods, human rights and civil rights. And this is the two periods that Dr. King presented. And I challenge anybody in the country to say it ain't so. These Pulitzer Prize winning folks, they and other writers and speakers and all these people that think they know King, you're an activist. So that's why you know Dr. Shaka. But the folks who don't know, they spew out anti-King craziness that has nothing to do with facts. That's why I say documentation beats conversation every day of the week. He shifts from moral issues. Now, as you said, he's talking about structural problems. He said that's the biggest issue, is the issue of the structural problem. You can't have a slum without slum lords that make it possible. This is why he's criticizing the structural problem, not a moral issue, but it's a structural problem. So he shifts. And if anybody looks at the record, they'll see that in the second period that he called the human rights period, he has fundamentally shifted altogether to all these areas from Black power. Now he's dealing with international concerns. He begins now to speak unequivocally about embracing liberation movements. He often talked about a nightmare. Oh yeah, he's not using reform anymore. He's talking about a revolution. He said it was a triple revolution: revolution in technology, a revolution in weaponry, and thirdly, a revolution in human rights. And that's what is the focus of Dr. King as he emerges in this second period to challenge folks. And he consistently told his, I'll give you, he told his staff that this is the areas that we must focus on. So if anybody is calling Dr. King a civil rights leader, they've distorted Dr. King. He's not only that, he moved beyond that. If they're focusing on him in just integration or focusing on the dream, they've distorted Dr. King. So these issues in the second period, they're prominent and they're dominant in every phase of not only his speeches and writings, but in his practice as well. And he lays out where do we go from here? And he's laying out all of these items in the human rights phase and not simply the first phase. So this is why it's really important to do the research. And one final thing is that in terms of human rights, which he's not usually looked at, in 1965, his organization, SCLC, their theme was human rights, basic issues, the Grand Alliance. And then in 1966, same thing, their national theme of his organization, where he was the president of the SCLC, he said in 66, human rights, the continuing struggle. So it's very clear that in 65 and 66, his organization's national focus was on human rights as they turned the corner. And so this is the King that really has to be known if we're going to understand the real Dr. King and not allow the public to continue to distort his legacy as an activist.
Wow. Uh-huh. That's what I say. You know, at church, you say, uh-huh. Right on, brother. I want to add some stuff because, you know, I've been in the mix, more than the mix. By the way, I met the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King in 1964. It was in the midst of the Bank of America campaign, which was the biggest job campaign in the Black Freedom Movement, the biggest bank in the world. And he had been attending a meeting with Reverend or Rabbi Alvin Fine, who was a part of the white establishment that did not support the San Francisco freedom movement, which was the only successful freedom movement in the North, the only one that kicked an entire power structures behind, but he could support the Southern one. And I mean, that's basically how the power structure in the North reacted. They were for the South, but they weren't for the North. You know what I mean? And so I had scheduled a meeting with him, and I'm a broke community organizer. You know what I mean? I was driving my girlfriend's car. You know, I didn't own a car. And so I meet him at Rabbi Alvin Fine's place, and King then allows me to get in his car. Now, I only had 25 cents in my pocket. Organized, we didn't get paid nothing in the North, you know, nothing. And so my mission was to get him to endorse the Bank of America campaign. Now he was going to the Cow Palace, and Malcolm had made observations on this rally at the Cow Palace later. And it was a fundraiser held by the Baptist Ministers Union and other ministers to raise money for King's organization. And Malcolm would observe how there had been some arguments in the NAACP over the amount of money King was getting and all the rest of this stuff. King didn't care about money. By the way, he got a Nobel Prize and all the money went to the movement. Malcolm didn't care about money either. And that's a real key point.
Yes.
If you love money, you ain't gonna love your people. Get that one straight for this hip hop generation.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Money don't come first. Your mama told you people come first. You know what I mean? So I explained this movement to him. I just explained the Bank of America campaign to him. And at that rally later that evening, Abernathy would also speak. And by the way, Abernathy gave a better speech. It was short, but it was one bad speech. So I said, Reverend King, we want you to endorse this campaign. And when you speak, say something about it. Because we're in the tail end of it. It had been a 6-month campaign. By that time, it was probably around 5 months, 3 months of negotiations, 3 months in the streets. We had been in the streets now 2 months, and it was statewide. And it was a masterful campaign. It was after a buildup. We had built a Black United Front in San Francisco with under the guidance of Will Ussery, who had been chair of CORE before me. He went to Birmingham and learned lessons from Birmingham and suggested we build a Black United Front. And in the spirit of the San Francisco Freedom Movement, we weren't into ego. And we had excellent relationships with all the groups. Either he or I should have chaired that Black United Front. And by the way, it's the only successful Black United Front organized in the 60s. Very important. And we decided, no, we're going to put a guy named Dr. Nathaniel Burbridge, who had 2 PhDs, 1 in pharmacology, 1 in medicine, in charge. He would be a co-chair. And a sister named Ardith Nichols in the Hunters Point, head of the Bayview Hunters Point Citizens Committee, would be the other co-chair. That gave us the unity of 2 Black communities, the Fillmore and the Hunters Point. And then that launched a 3-pronged mass action, 10,000 person campaign against the hotel and restaurant industry, against Auto Row and the Bank of America. Hotel and restaurant led by the ad hoc committee. Ad hoc committee was made up of UC Berkeley students, headed by a sister named Tracy Sims, a person who had stepped aside from San Francisco State at 18 and was leading that. And so they led that campaign. And then the NAACP under Burbridge. And what I want to say about this movement in San Francisco, Burbridge was one of 4 militant heads of the NAACP in the 60s. And there's no acknowledgement of him. The NAACP needs to acknowledge him. Robert Williams in Monroe was one of the militant ones. Medgar Evers was another. And then the head of the NAACP, Cecil Moore in Philadelphia. And then it was Burbridge in San Francisco. And Burbridge had set up the medical system for Indonesia. The American government would overthrow Indonesia and murder 1 million Indonesians. And it was under the leadership of Sukarno, and before the government was overthrown. And when Burbridge went to Indonesia, he set up the medical system for Indonesia. And when Sukarno came to San Francisco, the only person he wanted to meet with was Burbridge. So we put him in charge. I'm saying that as background because we did what King was trying to do. When he moved to Chicago, we had already mastered the urban environment. And it's too bad he didn't learn lessons from us, because we could show him how to deal with this northern environment, because the tactics he used in the South would only partially work in the North, only certain ones. And we learned from the South. And you know, we got some lessons from the South. One of the lessons that I learned that we shouldn't learn, when King took on the power structure in Birmingham, Will Ussery, who had been chair of CORE before me, wanted to do the same thing in San Francisco, take on the whole power structure, the political, the economic, the educational, the police, you know, all of them. I'm a strategist. I said, no, you don't do that. You put all your enemies in the same room. They're going to gang up on you. You're not going to get anything. You break them down piece by piece. So we tried it, didn't work. Then we broke them down. We had been doing that before. So when I met with King, it was in this backdrop of a movement that had been going on now for 5 years. This was a 6-year movement. I was in it the whole time, 6 years. This wasn't no 6-month movement. And so when I asked King to support us on the Bank of America campaign, he said, yeah, he would. So then I went to the rally to see what he'd say. Now, King was in a bind. The bind was the Baptist ministers had been our allies when we did the Christmas boycott. We boycotted downtown department stores. I was a strategist. I chaired the organization CORE. It led 90% of the demonstration. And in this particular case, we took weak links. We would always take on industries. We reached over 800 job agreements with industries, and they were enforced. Every job we produced then, people still have, by the way. And we didn't take one of them. You know what I mean? That was an unspoken rule, but that was true in the movement. That was King's thing. He was not in for profit. My code as a warriors, I don't take any money for any movement I've ever been in. Nobody owns me, not whites or blacks, because there are some blacks who will try and own you too. And even some misinformed grassroots blacks who will give you the wrong advice. Listen, but do what's right. So I said, Reverend, could you make that statement? So I went to the rally, and you could barely recognize that statement when King made that statement. And I know why, because these ministers, he knew enough to know they were on the outs with us now, because they sold us out after the downtown apartment stores. We had a victory there, and it was partially due to the church. They got their members not to buy where they couldn't work. But after that, there was a sellout. So that was my experience with the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King personally, but I understood his dilemma. He did say something, but it was so garbled. Nobody in there knew what he was saying. I said, okay, I understand. You know, we're going to whip him anyway. A couple of observations, and then we move on beyond this. I just want to stress that King was very humble in his statement about the minimal achievements of his movement, which he was correct. It didn't produce change in the North. It couldn't. That was a battle we had to fight up here, and King tried to begin that fight after 65. But I really want to stress this. The victories of the Southern movement were historically significant. This is the first defeat that white racism, I don't like using the term white supremacy, they ain't supreme, and they invented that term. And you disempower yourself every time you use it. And they're in decline now. But the key point is, this was the first defeat that those forces suffered since the battle of the Civil War, in which blacks were the balance of power and kicking the South's behind in the Civil War. 170,000 black soldiers were the key to Union victories, and the proof of the pie is in the pudding. Go to my show where I deal with how Black power defeated the Confederacy in the Civil War. Go look at that. It's got historical footage on it. Have your kids look at it. And we took advantage of the balance of power, and blacks got Winchester rifles and blew away their so-called slave masters. And we have a warrior tradition, so we need to be proud of that. So the point is, this was a historically significant defeat of white power, of white nationalism, of white racism. And if you don't think so, check out the right wing. The right wing now takes a position of dispossession. And one of the people that has the biggest dispossessed mentality was the former president who we threw out of the White House. And give yourself credit for that. You led that movement that dispossessed him. So they feel dispossessed because by breaking the monopoly of segregation legal-wise and breaking the monopoly on the vote, the complete stranglehold of white power was broken. We didn't, as King said, we didn't defeat racism. I don't know if you ever will, you know? Certainly not, you know, this overall system of white power, but it was a key breaking point. And so that is really key. Mm-hmm. Now, the other thing about King shifting in 65, why did King shift and others didn't? Why did some of us in the movement shift and others didn't? In King's case, King learned lessons. And so by 65, because he was in it for truth. He wasn't in it for anything else. And that's the first thing. If you're going to change in any movement or in life, you just got to follow the truth. King was following the truth. He didn't have a time to do a lot of reading. And in fact, when you're in the movement, you don't really have that much time to read. He did read, but he didn't have a lot of time because you're in the midst of struggle. And it was taxing on his health and everything else. But he reached conclusions. And so what he began to see, as you point out, ain't a moral system. He began to see that basic fundamental change has to take place. What I liked about King's formulation of human rights, because Malcolm also formulated the struggle as a human rights struggle, is he was more practical in his definition. Malcolm was more international in his. And so what he said is, that the period of civil rights is covered by the Constitution, the right to vote, all of this. But this period we're getting into now, where we need jobs, we need housing, we need better education, and we need a structural change in capitalism. This is beyond the Constitution. He understood that. And so, as you said, he said that they're going to have to pay for this period. It's going to cost to make these changes financially, politically, and structurally. So that is, I think, the main point. Those of us in the Black freedom movement who made this shift were those of us who also learned. And we learned in the San Francisco freedom movement, this was my lesson. We had defeated an entire economic power structure. We did a whole lot of stuff. But I saw beyond the success was this. That wasn't going to work for most Black people. The way and poor people in this country, the way the country is structured, it is not structured for political, social, or economic freedom. And that was part of my radicalization. And others were radicalized in other ways. The other thing is James Forman who was executive director of SNCC, he made this point. Those people in the movement who did their homework, who were studying and observing, they were the ones who became radicalized, those that chose to be. But others, they got stuck in the past. So John Lewis, who was a great person, I respect John Lewis, but he was stuck in the past because at that point he was frozen in 1965 and before. And that's why he was also attached to the Kennedys and stuff like that. And I'm not knocking him. I respect his work, but he didn't grow beyond 65. And growth is what a movement demands. Growth is what life demands. So those were just a few points. Now, as King of the Black freedom movement, or now Black liberation movement, faced new challenges after 1965, King made an honest admission when he said, quote, I'm quoting him, "We must frankly acknowledge that in the past years, our creativity and imagination were not employed in learning how to develop power." As King faced these new challenges, what did he learn about the nature of power, both Black and white? And did he learn enough to come up with answers necessary to confront the enemies that Blacks face, which he defined as racism, militarism, and the whole structure of this economy, capitalism? How did King, well, you've already answered this other one. So, the question is, what did he learn about power necessary to confront these enemies that face the Black poor and poor in this country in general?
Yeah, that's the key part for King, because as you were just alluding to, is he always talked about the triple evils of racism, militarism, and materialism. And after he was, and it's interesting to look at King's political development, because the opponents, they were strategists as well, and they were monitoring King all the way through. And in fact, we should say that Dr. King, he was the most surveillance and watched man in the history of the U.S. So from 1962 to his assassination in 68, the FBI surveillance on Dr. King was so tight that he couldn't even wiggle. And so they always had a strategy how to try to knock King out of his lobby. And one of the things that they understood is that this man was not committed to this so-called liberal philosophy that Dr. King. So what happened was in 64, Dr. King was given the Nobel Peace Prize when he never said a word about peace. He had no relationship to the peace movement. He had not participated in a peace demonstration, but yet he's given a Nobel Peace Prize in 64. And when he gets the prize, he goes he goes to Scandinavia. He gets this prize, which is named after Alfred Nobel, who was anything other than peaceful. Alfred Nobel, this man was absolutely violent. He created dynamite, for example, in 1867. In fact, Noble was somebody who made tons of money in developing armaments. But when King went, he started looking at Sweden and Scandinavia, and he came back with a completely different understanding. And that's when he began to systematically condemn the US capitalist system and said it's not a moral problem, but a structural problem. And so King understood the only way to challenge this structural system in the US is that there needed to be the, as he would always say, the acquisition of power. And that's when he started. He said the king would say things like this to get his his colleagues to understand this is a new phase now. We have to acquire power, as he consistently discussed and talked about. But he said that look, he didn't see any poverty, he didn't see homeless in these areas, he didn't see people that were unemployed, and he started criticizing the system. And he said this. So he started calling themselves a socialized Democrat. He didn't want to use socialism and get trapped into any system because he had problems with both capitalism and communism. But one of the things about King is that as he addressed the issue of a structural problem, he consistently talked about acquiring power. And he said that, hey, you know, if the world is 2/3 or 3/4 water, why do we have to pay water bill? And he begins to talk about the whole system of systematic exploitation of Black people and the poor. And he understood that that was a structural part of the system. You can't have poverty without wealth. So he always talked about, you know, the lonely island of poverty in a vast ocean of material wealth. So now he's somebody who is not only putting and keeping in the forefront the Black struggle, which was a struggle by folks who did not have power, but he understood that it was also a class issue. So he began to expand beyond just the Black community in the South. Now he's in the North. Now he begins to think internationally about how to internationalize the struggle and reach out. And he said that in terms of coalitions, far more progressive than other folks. In terms of coalitions, he said that unity does not mean uniformity. Doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything, but there's points of convergence. So this is when we now see is that for Black people in acquiring power, he also noted that would intersect with other groups. And so King began to look at how do we now bring in those that are disfranchised among the Mexican American community, Puerto Rican community, Native American community, and even Appalachian white people who are in tremendous poverty. And so King began to conceptualize a class movement against this upper class system that exploits the poor. And so this is why for King, it's not about anything other than going to the depths of the American problem and dealing with the issue of acquiring power. But he understood that, as he said, racism is as native as the pine trees, the sagebrush, and the buffalo grass. It's always been there. So we're going to have to confront this, as he would always say, the monster of racism and acquire power. So this is the focus of King, and this is why the FBI was becoming more and more concerned. And not only that, but William Sullivan, the second man in charge of the FBI, after King could galvanize hundreds of thousands of people along with his movement colleagues, they recognized it and they said, and their policy was Dr. King is the most dangerous so-called Negro in the country. They were more concerned with him because they knew they couldn't buy him off. And they knew that this man was unswerving in his condemnation of these white racists and white nationalists. And King was focused on the second phase of acquiring power. And this is what was in the concern. So for them, and not only that, but when he says the hell with it, I'm going to speak in behalf of the international community and the least of these, the shirtless and barefoot people of the world. And he begins to now publicly embrace the Vietnamese struggle. So they now knew that this man is, the gloves are off. This man is absolutely unswerving. And so this is when we enter into a phase in April of 1967 that Dr. King now is at a whole nother level of commitment and conviction. He's not limited by a strategy. He's recognizing that, you know what? I ain't had no victories in years now with civil rights. I mean, sorry, with nonviolence, and civil rights era is over. So I don't have any victories. So he's trying to figure out, what do we do to get to the heart of solving the race problem in America? And it was nothing other than a powerful mass-based movement that was to challenge the government to issue a economic bill of rights for the disadvantaged. that there should be billions put into this. So there'll be guaranteed jobs, guaranteed income. And so he begins to think about how to put this in motion. And that's when they eventually came up with organizing a poor people's campaign to force the government to make sure there's no more business as usual. And anybody who's listening at Dr. King's speeches at this time and his conferences at this time, and particularly in 67, know that this is not the same man that we heard from in 57. King is very different. So those are some of the critical issues that should be understood with King's work.
Yeah, that's very important that he had shifted to a radical position. There was right after the voting rights legislation had been passed, he met with his staff and said that there's a problem with this economic system, that you've got all this rich and you've got all these poor. And he said that there's a problem with capitalism. And he was talking about, well, maybe what we need is some kind of socialism. He was at least talking about that. That's in 65, you know what I mean? So, and he had read Marx when he was in college. He was not a Marxist. He did not like the lack of spiritual context within Marxism. But he said, well, Marx was right on how he analyzed what's wrong with the system.
Right.
Of course, he didn't analyze racism too well, but he analyzed the inequalities of capitalism. So that was a part of it. King made an observation when he was making this statement about that he had not been trained, or the movement had not really learned how to exercise power. And then he went on to say, that what we had engaged in was creative improvisational work that worked. You know what I mean? I don't think he understood he was describing how Black power works. See, this is again cultural definition. I study our culture. You know what I mean? King was a part of it. He was too close to it. I don't blame him for not understanding it. That wasn't his job. These scholars out here who got everything on Africa ain't bothered to study their own people. You know what I mean? So while he was right that he had not been trained to exercise power and that they were involved in movements that worked, they had come up with methods, but now he's faced with confronting structural power, the structure of, the economy, the structure of all these powerful forces that are oppressing Black folks, people of color, poor people. But what he failed to do was give himself enough credit. And here's the thing, in the midst of Montgomery bus boycott, this is what King says. He says, isn't it amazing how Black people can be so disciplined in the expression of their freedom? He didn't know he was defining one of the twin principles of freedom in African-American culture. In other words, as Frederick Douglass said, you're not going to get freedom unless you have the mighty roar of the oceans. It's going to take struggle. Well, in the African-American conception of freedom, discipline is a precondition for freedom. And in fact, discipline is freedom. And in fact, the Montgomery bus boycott is one classic example, was not all improvised. It had been planned. It was both spontaneous and planned at the same time. And when he noted that it was through our creativity that we found methods that work, well, that's African-American culture. Our definition of freedom is to create something that will improve the lives of humanity. In other words, our definition of freedom is to create rather than to use power on any level for oppression or anything else. Our goal for power is to enable the human being to have their full voice. And so, in fact, he was able to move the way he moved because this was in him. You know what I mean? This was in him. Now we need to understand what's in us that works. What's good about that? It means that whenever we move, we don't even know how we're going to move until we move. That's how creative we are. Malcolm was in Ghana talking about how a day would come when we would be free and we create a new society and blah, blah, like the jazz musician, one day we'd have the power. We're already doing it. And Malcolm was one of them. He was formulating some very advanced thought, because when you free the mind, everything else is going to follow. You don't need to have the new society yet. It's inside of you. So on the one hand, King had that grasp, the movement had that grasp, and to the extent that the movement operated on the culture, that's where the movement was successful. And that's why that Southern movement was so successful. So I take my hat off, not just to King, but the activists, everyday people who came up with this. You know what I mean? Like my grandmother, I talked about her before. My great grandmother came up with slop gullion, got everything out of the pantry and put it into a pot, and it looked like nothing and came up with something. You know what I mean? That's how we do it. You know what I mean? So that was one dimension of power. But the other dimension that he was confronting was the power elite. He was confronting the ruling class, people that run this country. And he was learning how that worked. But I would say today, you'd better study that. And the best book on this is a book on the power elite called Dummhoff, Who Rules America Now? This is the second edition. That's the best one that's been done on the study of the ruling class, but it's not sufficient. I'm updating my book on the art of leadership that took me 10 years to write, that deals with power. And I'm going to be substantially going beyond his analysis, but his analysis is the best out there so far. So part of knowing power is to know how they wield it. Another thing is King and the movement, because the movement was a movement of struggle, so demonstrations, boycotts, stuff like that. The movement didn't really learn how to build institutions. Institutions are the basis of power in this country. The corporate institutions run the world, but institutional power is fundamental. And so whatever kind of power you have, then one of the things you need to do is translate it into institutions. I learned that from Garvey, you know. Another thing is power. King was a manifestation. SNCC core manifestations. The Panthers, the Black Power movement, these were all manifestations of our people's expression of power. But where is real power among Black people? It's in the people. Our power comes from our people. The biggest failure in the Black freedom movement has been not to properly organize our people. And the most effective form of organizing, I've said this before, is block organizing. We did that in the San Francisco Freedom Movement. 45,000 Black people in the Fillmore organized block by block. And
you know what, Doc, in terms of that, one of the things that is one of the greatest problems that we have is not understanding community organizing. So for example, one of the greatest examples is the Montgomery bus boycott, because number one, they learned from the Baton Rouge, Louisiana bus boycott in '53 that was not successful. They had too many demands. It was too diffuse. They needed to focus on specific goals. So when Rosa Parks was arrested on December 1st, 1955, she was the legal secretary of the NAACP. So she had been a part of those strategy meetings of the NAACP of how they were going to take on the cradle of the Confederacy, Montgomery, and the Jim Crow system. So they were waiting on the right test case, and the organizations were the NAACP. Edie Nixon, as you mentioned, was the head of that, and the Women's Political Council, Joanne Robinson. So these were the leaders of these organizations. And so when people think that, well, it was just Rosa Parks one day, got tired and didn't want to give up her seat, it's the fallacy that Black folks make too often of elevating individual leaders. It's not about individuals, it's about organizations. The group is more important than the individual. So if we look at why that boycott was successful, 99% of Black folks for more than a year, 381 days, they did not ride the bus. That's tough. 381 days, 99% compliance. So when Rosa Parks was arrested December 1st, she called Edie Nixon, and he then got the call out to these leaders, King and a lot of other ministers and other people in the community. They already had a phone tree set up. So the phone tree was set up. The carpool was set up. So E.D. Nixon, as you said, he called King. King was, well, let me get back to you, Brother Nixon. I'm not sure. They had already organized the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. And so Joanne Robinson already had thousands of leaflets already made up that read another Negro woman arrested. They were waiting on the right test case. So Claudette Colvin didn't give up her seat, but she's 15, she's young, and she was pregnant but not married. So, the white racists would have been focusing on her alleged immorality. They would focus allegedly on that as opposed to the issue. But Rosa Parks, she was tested. She's 42. She's in the struggle, and she's a legal secretary, and she can withstand those white racists and white nationalists that would be bombing places. And folks don't understand. It's not Rosa Parks. It's not individuals. It's the organizations that came together to form the Montgomery Improvement Association. And so, to a degree, Rosa Parks did feed into it in some interviews much later. Well, hey, Miss Parks, why did you not give it your seat? Well, I'm tired. It wasn't just her being tired that day. They had already had the strategy in place. How in the world can she get arrested on Thursday, December 1st, 1955 in the evening, and the call goes out the next day on Friday that there's going to be a boycott starting Monday, December the 5th. It's a weekend. Most people, they may have a phone, they may not have a phone. It's not the technological age. You can't tweet it out. You can't text. No cell phones. Word got out to the barbershops, the beauty shops in the community. You talk about word of mouth organizing. This was the best. So Monday, they were stunned. They didn't expect 99%. So they had station wagons, carpools, and it lasted. And then people started to find out about this great movement. They were donating money, vehicles. There was little old ladies, little old men walking to work, walking downtown, and they didn't want to ride. People rolled down the window, Miss Jackson, can I give you a ride? Baby, you don't understand. I'm walking for my dignity. And this was over a year, total compliance, but it's not the individuals, the organization.
Exactly.
So I would say if somebody's going to start talking about individuals, Joanne Robinson is more important if you're going to look at an individual than the actions of Rosa Parks. But it's not really about ranking people. It's looking at their collective role within the organization. So that's the fallacy we make. Whenever we do tributes, it's always individuals and not the organizations that produced them. And that's what's the most important thing. That's one of the greatest organizational stories that we have in the 20th century right there in Montgomery.
Yeah, big success.
Expect that. Yeah.
Big victory. But I'm going to end on this and get back to another question. Block organizing, because that's where you put people together, and people at the neighborhood level are able to be put into units. And then around those units, they're able to build power. Harold Washington, when he was elected mayor of Chicago, I was national vice chair, the National Black United Front. I told Conrad Worrell, who was then chair, I said, you should use this to do block organizing, because in fact, Chicago's organized on blocks. It's the Irish mafia that, not really mafia, but the Irish power structure that really organized Chicago. And they send you chickens and turkeys and get you out to vote for the Democratic machine. I ain't talking about that, but they had a structure, you know what I mean? And Harold Washington, it turns out, didn't take care of his health. He was overweight. He had a heart attack. And the thing went down. Later, Lou Palmer, who was a major figure in getting him to run for office, said, we made a big mistake. We should have organized the community while he was in office. You still can, but it would have been easier because you'd have had the mayor's resources and a rallying figure to organize behind. So power is real key, and wielding power is real key. And it's no joke. And it lies in your people. Now, I want to get to two other questions and we'll wrap this up. How did King respond to the war in Vietnam? How did his position on the war impact his organization, his relationships with Johnson, his relationships with the Black establishment, and most importantly, because there's been a whole lot of stuff on how Black people themselves opposed his stand on the war in Vietnam. What was the grassroots response to King's stance on the war in Vietnam?
Well, I appreciate it. Well, King started to criticize the war in Vietnam back in '65. He was embracing liberation movements in Africa going back to the '50s, as I mentioned earlier. And when he started to criticize the U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War around '65, he was criticized by civil rights leaders in the media. But when he said, you know what, the hell with it, I'm going to embrace all of it. So King began to deal with it on another level on April 4th, 1967, when he came out with his speech Beyond Vietnam at the Riverside Church. That's the one that people quote on a regular basis. The only issue is that, some knuckleheads, they online and other places, they rename the speech like a time to break silence. No, that's a different speech, but they don't know the difference. It's Beyond Vietnam. And this is when Dr. King is not only criticizing the U.S. involvement in Vietnam War, he takes it further. He condemns the United States as the great, quote unquote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, my own government. And he also says this is why this is so important, because he's not only saying that, but he's calling for support of revolutionaries in Vietnam. He said these are revolutionary times. All over the globe, men are revolting against old systems of exploitation and oppression, and out of the wombs of a frail world, new systems of justice and equality are being born. The shirtless and barefoot people of the world are rising up as never before. We in the West must support these revolutions. And he goes on and said, so he's saying we need to support them. And he says that the U.S. destroyed the Vietnamese two most cherished institutions, the family and the village, and the U.S. must pay reparations. And he went on to say that, and he would always say this on a regular. He would take a John F. Kennedy quote and say, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." So this is when Dr. King split from a lot of these more conservative people, black people, because he didn't care at that point. This is when he unswervingly condemned those people who were kind of supporting the civil rights legislation. He said Congress, quote unquote, is running amok with racism. This is when Dr. King split with white liberals, white moderate. He already had issues with the white church. Now he's got problems with government officials and these civil rights folks, because he was not working with any of them at all. He split with most of these people. So now Dr. King is most associated with the Black Power advocates. This is the group that he is embracing and meeting with. They thought they had secret meetings in DC, but as I said earlier, the FBI had everything wiretapped and bugged. It was a tight surveillance system on King. So King emerged now as a leader who was calling out for international justice and linking that international struggle for freedom with the Black struggle in the US in a way that he had not done before. Because when he got condemned, he thought he needed to keep the movement tight during that first period. But by 67, the hell with it. And he starts talking about a third world revolution. And that we had to understand why these nations would go through, as he said, the same extremism, revolution, and aggression that form our history. He's always now beginning to refer to the American Revolutionary War in the 1770s, 1780s, when the 13 colonies fought against Britain to become independent. So King is not holding back anymore now. This is a totally different man. And I would bet you this, Doc, you let people listen to those speeches. Don't even tell them who it is. Most would not think it's King. They say, who's that? Malcolm or somebody? No, that's Dr. King, the one that you didn't learn about in school. So you learn about that King who emerged, and it's a totally different man. So, but now he's been elevated to I had a dream. He's been frozen in the I had a dream concept rather than his true activism. But that's when people in the movement were very concerned about associating with King, because they were too safe and conservative. And that's why he called them, in his own term, Mickey Mouse Negroes.
A couple of wrap-up questions here, one that I just came up with. I've been coming up with a number of them that I didn't have on my sheet. King and Malcolm on human rights. Contrast the positions. How were they similar? And what was King's attitude towards Malcolm's posture on human rights? And was Malcolm in any way aware of King's posture on human rights?
Well, as you know, Doc, so most people they see King and Malcolm, and it's the same old rhetoric by the so-called conscious people who ain't read very much at all. It's the same old rhetoric. They'll say King and Malcolm, total polar opposites. You got Christian, Muslim, one's focused on peace, the other one violence and self-defense. Then you got one's in the South, the other one's in the North. One is on civil rights, focused on civil rights, the other one human rights. But in reality, King had been focusing on human rights before Malcolm begins to talk about it. Malcolm is not free from the ideological imprisonment until he leaves the nation in 64. King was already clear about many of these things. So Malcolm, clearly a leader on human rights, for sure. He's free, he's independent, but he's also on the sidelines in terms of practical actions. And what you mentioned about King and their successes, you know, he was close to it, but he also understood they put the building blocks in place for things to change, but it would take some time to take place. But nevertheless, I think that Malcolm clearly, he was speaking about human rights much more forcefully and clearly before King did, but they both understood the commonality that they had, and that's why when they met, or Malcolm had, they met in 64, and then 65, when Malcolm goes to Selma, he wants to meet with Dr. King and form an alliance. But, you know, King was in jail at the time, so they didn't actually meet, but it was 2.5 months before Malcolm's assassination, or 2.5 weeks, 2.5 months before his assassination, but they agreed. Malcolm said he would help with the civil rights work, but they both were also discussing, particularly Malcolm. King came a little bit after that regarding human rights, but they certainly had much more in common than they had in conflict, and Malcolm understood that. And he always respected people like King, but Ella Baker warned him, don't be naive, Malcolm, because some of these people are too conservative for you to work with. But he didn't include King in that category. It was some of the other people. So Malcolm was much more astute on some of these dynamics, but I think that King is overlooked in terms of his international focus in embracing revolutionary moves before Malcolm. But I think we can say Malcolm started to articulate human rights before King did. But in 65, King is unswervingly committed in articulating human rights as well. But these men have much more in common, and this constant polar contrast is just some silly intellectual nonsense that is not consistent on the ground when we see all of the things that they had in common. And Malcolm said, you will either deal with King or you're going to have to deal with me. And so Malcolm understood his role, you know, beginning in 64 and particularly 65. So it was important to make sure that these brothers representing two wings didn't really come together in a practical way. So eliminating Malcolm was very important at that time. So to me, we know, as I'm sure as Brother Zach indicated, and I've known Zach, Brother Kondo, from the old Baltimore, D.C. days, but the FBI had, and the government had, particular deadlines and when they wanted these leaders to be eliminated. And I think that we can look at some events that took place to indicate when they ratcheted up their campaign to eliminate both of these leaders at the time they were eliminated. If we had more time, that's important. I know that you already talked about it with Brother Zach, but I think King's assassination deserves more scrutiny as well.
Yeah, we'll do that at another time. I'll just simply say the government killed him, and there's plenty of evidence for it. The point that's being made about King and Malcolm having more in common is profoundly true. I have a speech that I've delivered. It's called King and Malcolm, Two Who Were One and Didn't Even Know It. And what I do is I list 37 agreements between King and Malcolm, and 4, you could call them differences, but they were really circumstances. Like, how can you be effectively violent in America? You know what I mean? Effectively have an effective violent movement. So you're going to say that nonviolence and self-defense are in conflict. King wasn't in conflict, as you pointed out, with self-defense. And Malcolm couldn't shoot. There's a picture of Malcolm with a 30 caliber carbine with the big magazine sticking out in his window. Now, I'm ex-soldier. I know how to take a weapon apart and put it together blindfolded. Malcolm had probably never shot a weapon. But the main thing is he didn't know that 30 caliber weapon he had didn't have a firing pin. That means that somebody got into his house and took the firing pin out. You know what I mean? Huh? So like, the differences on nonviolence and self-defense ain't as great as they're made out to be, but basically, they shared a common set of views that transcended that. And that's also because the law of the universe is unicity. We're one. And they both came out of similar cultural backgrounds. One's father was a Jack Leg preacher. The other one's father was a preacher. You know what I mean? There's a host of things that they had in common. One of the things on human rights I think that's important to stress is that King supported Malcolm's human rights appeal. And in fact, King's attorney was close to Malcolm's. And so they were sending messages back and forth to each other. And King had sent the message that he supported what Malcolm was doing on human rights. What people don't understand is, on the one hand, and I pointed this one out before, Malcolm's position on human rights was heavily shaped by Paul Robeson, who was his first master. And Paul Robeson's not only anti-war position, but the appeal that was sent to the United Nations on genocide. And so when Malcolm took up the issue of human rights, he would often say human rights, and then he'd slip and say genocide. And that was Paul Robeson. But the other side of this is, by the end of his life, people in the nation had noticed, the messenger certainly knew, Malcolm's family had observed that Malcolm was sounding more like the civil rights movement than the Nation of Islam, because the movement had affected him. We're always focusing on the effect that Malcolm had on the movement. He had a big effect. But the movement had a bigger effect on him because the movement's bigger than a single person. And so when he's internationalizing the struggle as a human rights struggle, he's internationalizing the Black freedom movement. That's basically what he's doing. He's bringing before the United Nations and other bodies, but particularly at this point, the Organization of African Unity, the charge of how Blacks are being oppressed, and it is the example of the Black freedom movement. And when he says he wants consultation with the Young Turks in the Black freedom movement. I led the Black nationalist wing within CORE, and we met with him. I pointed this out before. He was in interchange with us because we were on the battlefield. He was being held in reserve, not until he got out, when he was out in 64, forced out. So that human rights position was coming from pretty much the same position. He was taking the civil rights movement, taking it to the human rights level, changing the name. But I think King was clear on why it was a human rights issue domestically, because he was engaged in the ground level struggle. And now you are transcending the Constitution. Now you're going into stuff, because that Constitution has never given you the right to a job. It's never given you the right to housing. It's never given you the right to healthcare. It's never given you the right to any kind of power. You can speak, but don't speak too loud, like King and Malcolm. Then suddenly, your voice is silent. So.
Yeah, that's true. And Doc, so I have to get to another group, but I wanted to say this in reference to what you said, because the audience, the folks looking, they're not necessarily going to be aware of what are Dr. King's most important speeches on human rights, and that is the one he gave on December 10th, 1965, Human Rights Day, and he talked about this, as he said, the spectacular savages in South Africa. But Human Rights Day, King had been participating in international political work for a while, but that speech people should listen to and understand that is much bigger than just the I Have a Dream. But even then, as I said earlier, most people don't even know the content of the speech. He's condemning police brutality and a lot of other things. So what you say is right. And it's so much to say, but one other nugget, to bring King closer to Malcolm, for example, most people incorrectly believe that King was focused on integration. No main aspect of his life was focused on integration. For example, here's the public facts. Number one, his family was all Black. He could have had integrated families if he wanted to, but he didn't. Family was all Black. His neighborhood, the Auburn Avenue area, was all Black, traditionally Black, middle class environment. His organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was all Black. They only brought in Stanley Livingston and others for as advisors, but all of the primary people Black. And fourth, his church, Ebenezer Baptist Church, historically Black Baptist church. So everything is all Black. His family is all Black. His neighborhood is all Black. His organization is all Black. His church is all Black. Where's the integration? There's no integration.
Right.
Some people wanted to integrate and even amalgamate and make sure that nobody was dark skinned anymore. King didn't agree with any of that. So this idea of Malcolm focus on separation, King integrate, stop all the nonsense, folks. This has nothing to do with reality. And I challenge folks to read his stuff. You know, this is the online era. Go online. You don't have to do what I did. You don't have to go to the archives. Go check it out from your comfort of your living room and read Dr. King and interpret and apply what it is. And we'll know that it ain't about a dream. It's about organizing. He's not a dreamer. He's a practical activist. So that's that's just a small part of really what we discussed today and what can be done to follow up. So I appreciate just the
Manu, you know, before you run, list the books that King wrote for people.
Okay. All right. So King wrote 5 books, folks. Number 1, he wrote Stride Towards Freedom. He discussed the Montgomery bus boycott. That's number 1. Secondly, he was a minister, so he wrote Strength to Love. Third book is Why We Can't Wait, because the racists would say, you Black folks, why don't you just wait and let time solve the problem? King said time is neutral. It can be used effectively or ineffectively. So the third book he wrote, Why We Can't Wait. The fourth book is Trumpet of Conscience. He gave a series of lectures in Canada and converted those into a book, Trumpet of Conscience. And his last and fifth book is Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? Now, this man was working 20-hour days, and that's it. That's the last one. And how did he spend, how did he get a chance to write? December, January of every year, he would go to Jamaica for reflection, review, and writing. And that's what he did. That's how he wrote his 5 books. So if people read his books, they have a different perspective altogether. And if they go to my website, ManuAmPim, I have .com. There's a few items that I have posted there, but my work I will publish to be the revolutionary Dr. Martin Luther King, the evolution of a revolutionary.
Very good. Now there's a question you're probably not going to have time to answer, but I'm just going to raise it. Lao Tzu, one of our dedicated followers and of the show and a deep reader, he said, Dr. Manu, going forward, how do we create movements and leadership that resist, survive, and grow despite internal and external forces working against us?
Just got to do what folks did all along, 50s and 60s. You know, we've lost great warriors along the way, but people have to understand that that's their calling in life. You know, what's your incarnation objective? What are you here to do? But like Dr. King said, a coward dies 1,000 deaths, but a real man stands up. And this is why, so what we got to do, brother, is do what King said. And that is we have to do things and move forward because it's right. We can't do things because it's politic or it's convenient or it's popular or it's safe. We have to take a stand because it's right. And again, the group is more important than the individual. So it's just a matter of all of us being serious about our mission in life. We got to find it and fulfill that mission, and we will always make progress. Look at when we always organize, and we organize and not be concerned about being safe, then we make great progress. So it's just doing, brother, what we've already have done. And that's why knowing the 60s and 50s on a different level will help us. So we should stop all the individual worship and look at the organizations that produce the results. That's why we have to revisit Montgomery and other places to really know what we can do. And I tell people, be quiet when you say Black people can't work together. What the hell are you talking about? What about Montgomery? It's a great shining example of organizations coming together so that's what it is, brother. It's, you know, when I wrote my book, you know, when I write and, you know, and people always, oh, you shouldn't do that. Well, first of all, who are you talking to? There's no fear here. It's all about fulfilling the mission. So that's the main point, though, brother, is that we all got to play our role. So from this, you know, get the word out and let people watch this and follow up on Dr. King's, not only his writings, but his program. See, that's the point. Look at his program. Where do we go from here? He ain't talking about no damn dream. He's talking about practical steps to solve the race problem in America for us. So that's
Yeah.
what I was saying.
Okay, I want to thank Professor Menu Ampin. He has another engagement after this. This has been one heck of a discussion. Menu, we're all proud of you. You keep up the work. You got my support.
Yes,
And there's
sir.
some lessons you have to give me on computerese. So I'm gonna be calling you for those lessons.
Yes,
Okay.
sir. You're good for it.
Right on, brother.
Okay, thank you,
Yeah.
Doc. I
Yeah.
appreciate it. Yeah, we pushing forward. Okay. All right. Thank you. I
Okay.
appreciate the opportunity. All right.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm. Okay, there are a few more questions or comments up here before we wrap up. Uh, Rice Weeks, Mr. Tashaka, where can consumers purchase your full catalog of books for fair market value? And there's another note up here by the same lady that said, Amazon is selling my Return to the African Mother Principle, male and female equality, for $807.77. Now you can be sure, and I think she said, is this a used copy? Oh, yeah, used copy. For your information, I'm the writer. I do my own publishing, and I distribute my own books. And that book costs $24.95. So if you want to go and pay $807.77, that's a ripoff, but it is telling you something. That book's a classic. And once we're to 1,000, and we may well reach 1,000 today of viewers, then we're going to be able to put up on our screen our books and where you can get them. Gumroad is the place where you go over to Shaka Gumroad, and you can purchase the Integration Trap. I've asked my team to put up the rest of my books. The books that I have available right now are Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, $24.95, brand new. And I autograph it if you buy it. The Art of Leadership, Volume 1. Volume 2 is out of print. We're going to republish it soon. And the Integration Trap, Generation Gap Caused by a Choice Between Two Cultures. The book, The Political Legacy of Malcolm X, is out of print. And in all likelihood, when it comes back, it'll be revised. There'll be a revised version of that. And the Political Legacy, the Art of Leadership, Volume 2. Once we sell out Volume 1, we'll be putting out a Volume 1 and 2 again, or I may decide to combine the two volumes. I'm not sure. And I'm doing slight reworking on the Art of Leadership by adding a section on the power structure and a few other things that will be done at another time. But these books took me 10 years to write, and they come from experience as well as study. And I've lost no battles. So these are not guesses and stuff. And they're not on great Black leaders. They're on leadership systems, philosophies, and practices. Cinnabar puts up here Gumroad, which is correct, AFAR Gumroad. And you purchase the book there, and then we mail the book to you directly from here. I have my books here, so later for that. Let's see. Gladys Harris said that The Whiteness of Wealth by Dorothy A. Brown is a good read. I assume that that's to understand the white power structure of the ruling class and how it works. And that's a good suggestion. And I think I saw the other comments. I don't think they're questions, but let me just look and see. Yeah, those are those are basically the questions that people ask. And so that really concludes this show. I hope that you got a lot out of it, and we will see you next week.